Why is this important? Why do we spend so much time talking about the resurrection of Christ? Because we as Christians, if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, then we have a resurrection faith. Our faith is tied to the resurrection, all right? Paul said it like this, and I think it's clear as can be. If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is worthless, and so is your faith. Paul does not mince words here. He pins the entire Christian faith, everything we believe, the linchpin of that faith is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It is a historical event, and all of Christianity comes down to that single event. What do you do with the empty tomb? And so we're going to kind of talk about some historical facts first. I'm going to give you the three primary facts, I think. And then I have some supporting facts that kind of act like scaffolding for it. And I'm going to show you both in church as well as in secular history how these things actually point to the validity and the accuracy of the New Testament. So fact number one, okay? Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical person. He lived. He was tried by Pontius Pilate. He was then crucified to death. Okay? This is, surprisingly, not that controversial. Okay? Jesus was real. You can't say, oh, he didn't exist. He was a myth. No, he really lived. Okay? All four Gospels tell us that Pontius Pilate is the one who had him executed. Okay? As you see here in John, as well as the other three Gospels, okay, Pilate sits on the judgment seat. He finally gives in to the pressure, and he hands Jesus over to be executed. We turn to the historical records of Josephus. Josephus was a first century Jewish Roman historian. He was on the Jews. He betrayed them, and then he went to work for the Romans. And then he wrote about the history of the Jews. And when he gets to this time frame, he says very plainly, there was a man named Jesus. Pilate condemned him to be crucified. About 30 years after Josephus wrote his Antiquities, another Roman historian by the name of Tacitus, he was reflecting back on stuff that happened in the 60s, about the time of Nero and the Christian persecution and the Roman fire and all of that. But he's talking about the Christians, and he tells you where they came from. In Tacitus, again, no dog in the hunt, he's just a secular Roman historian. He says, Nero inflicted the most awful tortures on a class that was hated for their abominations. Remember, they're pagans looking at Christians, and the Christian practices in their minds are abominations. They were called Christians by the populace, Christus, Latin, from whom their name had its origins, suffered the extreme penalty, crucifixion, during the reign of Emperor Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So we see biblical history, church history, and secular history also. Hey, Jesus was a real guy. Pilate had him executed. Okay. Fact number two, all. I stress that word all because it's important, because we have a bunch of Christians in here, and if I asked you all to give me your opinions about the end times, I bet we would have, if we have 100 people, we'll have 300 different opinions. So getting us to agree on stuff can be hard sometimes. So when we all do agree on something, it's important. All of the first followers of Jesus said he rose from the grave bodily. He wasn't a ghost. He was flesh and blood, even under the threat of death, as kind of that video highlighted a little bit. All right, Jesus said himself, look at my hands, look at my feet, it is myself, touch me, see, a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have. Then he said, give me something to eat, and he ate some fish. Right? And they were willing to die for this belief, okay? You see Paul goes to a town, and they don't like what he says, so they take him out and they stone him. Now, whether God does a miracle or whatever happened, or Paul gets up and he's bruised, Paul's followers go up to him and thinking he's dead. Paul sits right up, goes back into the town that just killed him, packs up his stuff, and he goes to another town the next day. Like, the dude was hardcore, okay? It's like, I'm going to go to the hospital, take 6 months off, maybe a year. He was on the road the next day. Why? Because he believed in the resurrected Christ. Again, we turn to Josephus, and that's in his same writings of antiquities. He says, those who had become Jesus' disciples, they did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. So here is a secular historian who's saying, yeah, those Christians claim Jesus is alive. He's not saying, I believe it. He's just saying, this is what the Christians believe. Then we turn to church history. Clement. Clement was a second-generation Christian, okay? He was a follower of Paul, in fact, Paul mentions him by name in Philippians 4:3. And Paul wrote a letter to the church in Corinth, and about 5 decades after Paul wrote his, Clement is writing a letter of his own. He's writing around the same time that John is actually penning the book of Revelation. Only Clement is not scripture, obviously, but he was alive at that time, and he heard the gospel directly from the apostles, okay? He's getting taught the gospel directly from the horse's mouth, directly from the apostles themselves. And this is what he wrote. He said, the apostles preached to us, okay? The gospel. They were fully assured by the resurrection of our Lord Jesus, and they were established in the word of God. They went forth preaching throughout the countries and the cities. So here is a student of the apostles saying, yeah, they believed in the resurrection of Jesus. Here is church history, and here is secular history, again, affirming the same thing. Fact number 3, arguably, I think, the most important. Even Jesus' strongest followers and critics, whether they loved him or they hated him, they all agreed the body was missing from the tomb. They came up with different explanations as to why, but they all agreed it was empty. Okay? The most famous account of this, of course, is in Matthew 28, where the Roman guards who are guarding the tomb, they go back to the chief priests and they say, the body's gone, what should we do? And the Jewish leadership basically gives them a bribe and say, hey, you're to say that we fell asleep at night and his disciples came and stole the body. And that was the natural explanation that the Jews were giving for this supernatural event. As time went on and the temple got destroyed, different Jewish rabbis, as they began to form the Talmud and the later Jewish teachings in the 400 and 500 ADs, Talmudic Jews actually put forth a supernatural explanation as to why the body was missing. There was a guy around this time who they did not like. I can't pronounce his name very well, but Oken, yeah, that guy. He was a Roman convert to Judaism, and they accused him of witchcraft and necromancy. And in the Talmud, which is a Jewish sacred book, they basically said that that gentleman, this Roman convert to Judaism who betrayed them, that's why they didn't like him afterwards, that he raised Jesus using necromancy. So that a sorcerer came along and raised Jesus from the grave. And that Jesus was a sorcerer too, and he was leading Israel astray. And so you had one demon-worshipping exorcist, necromancer, raising Jesus, who himself was, when actually this does match well with what the Bible said as far as when Jesus did a miracle, many of the Pharisees would say, oh, it's by the power of the devil that you do that, or you're possessed by a demon, right? They're saying that Jesus did his miracles because of demonic power. And here you see the same thing, okay? Again, they all agree the body's gone, whether they're coming up with natural explanations or demonic explanations. No one denies that he did miracles. No one denies that the body was missing. Okay? We're just haggling over the details of the source of it. Even the Romans acknowledged that Jesus is gone. I talked about this in a previous conversation, in a previous thing that I did. This is called the Nazareth inscription. It was found in the 1870s by archaeologists. Why would you put a sign in stone in the middle of nowhere town like Nazareth? Oh, wait, yeah, that's where Jesus was from. And essentially what this does is, under the penalty of death, it makes grave robbing of bodies illegal. So if you steal a body, it's now a crime punishable by death. Okay, and you ask the question, well, why? Because grave robbers don't steal corpses. They steal gold and valuables. Okay? That's why in Egypt we have a lot of mummies and not a lot of gold. Okay? That's why they love King Tut, because grave robbers never found him. He was nobody special. He was one of the most unimportant people. He's like, the Millard Fillmore of pharaohs. He means nothing. But he was famous because of what they found with him. And in the case here, why? Why are they making grave robbery of bodies and corpses illegal? And why are we putting that law, that plaque, in Jesus' hometown? Well, that would be very odd. If the Romans believed that someone came and stole Jesus' body, then this law and this plaque issued in 41 AD makes perfect sense. As Dr. Clyde Billings, an archaeologist, put it in one archaeology magazine, he said, quote, "The context of the Nazareth inscription almost certainly issued by Claudius in response to the story of Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, at the instigation of the Jewish king Herod Agrippa I in 41 AD. So even the Romans believed the body was missing, and they wrote a law making sure that it wouldn't happen again. These secondary facts, these are important, right? Because these kind of act as the scaffolding, and this is kind of what we're building off of. Roman soldiers are guarding the tomb to prevent theft. There's a giant stone there, there's a seal on it, and failure had a cost, okay? Now, most of you, if you've spent any time in church, you've heard some pastor or some Sunday school teacher tell you that if the Romans failed at their job, the penalty was death, okay? Most of you have heard that before, but do you actually know where that comes from? Have you ever actually looked for the source as to okay, yeah, I know that if the Romans fail, okay, yeah, but who said that? Well, I'm going to show you. I'll tell you right now. But the instigation for this comes from Pilate, right? Pilate said, take a guard, go make the tomb as secure as you know how. And so they went and made this tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and by posting a guard. This is kind of one of those things, it's one of those catch-22 things. If the Pharisees had done absolutely nothing, the bare minimum, just leave the rock there, no guards, no seal, no nothing, and leave Jesus' tomb unguarded, then somebody coming and stealing the body is actually plausible. But because they went all out to make sure that no one could get in, they shot themselves in the foot. Do you get it? If they had done nothing, their excuse for why his body is missing works. But because they went all out, their excuse falls apart. The failure of Romans punishable by death, it comes from a Roman historian. He wrote a book called The Histories, makes it simple. I can't pronounce that Roman word. I'm not going to try to and pronounce the Latin, but fustiterium, whatever. He wrote this in the 140s around the time of the Third Punic War. Hannibal, if you know that, is in the Second Punic War, if you know Hannibal and his elephants and all that. This is the third one right after that. He wrote, when a soldier was found guilty of desertion, theft, negligence, that's the one we care about, or other such crime, the tribune, the commander, touched him slightly with a cudgel, a club, upon which all the soldiers of the legion would fall upon him with sticks and stones and generally kill him on the spot. There's about 4,000 to 6,000 people in a legion. If somehow he did escape, he was not safe. He could not return to his native country, nor did any of his relatives even dare to give him aid. The extreme severity of the penalty ensured that the night watches of the Roman army were kept scrupulously. You fail, you die. Okay, if you think of it, even in the scripture you see this, right? When Paul gets shipwrecked, the commander who had all the guards was going to kill himself. He's like, no, we're all here. Okay? So you see that even playing out in the New Testament times too. Fact number 5. This one is, I think, one of the most important for sure. The once fearful followers of Jesus, the guys who were too afraid to go to the cross, the guys who were hiding in the upper room, the guys who were trembling, who ran away when they came to arrest Jesus, suddenly they are bold and willing to die for their faith. Okay? After seeing the resurrected Christ, his followers go from terrified little kitty cats to lions. Where's that change come from? What would precipitate such a 180-degree change? Right? As Peter said at Pentecost, God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are eyewitnesses of it. Okay? Stephen died for this belief. The same people who killed Jesus 3 years later, they pull Stephen out when he says Jesus is the Christ. He rose from the grave. You killed him. You stubborn, stiff-necked people. What is wrong with you? The Sanhedrin heard this. They were furious. They gnashed their teeth at Stephen. They all rushed him. They dragged him out of the city and they began to stone him. Meanwhile, witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. More on Saul in a minute. Stephen died for this, and he became the first of millions of martyrs who have given their lives over 2 millennia for Jesus Christ. There was a comedian who lived in the 2nd century. His name was Lucian. He was a Greek comedian. If you take like Joe Rogan, Bill Maher, and like Howard Stern, and you like kind of mix them all together, that is this guy. He loved to make fun of Christians. That was his favorite thing, okay? He loved making fun of their naiveness and how gullible they were, because these guys are following Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Love your neighbor. Like he loved to manipulate, and so that was his stand-up routine. So this is a guy who is completely against Christians, other than making fun of them. And his mockery actually is wonderful proof for what the Christians actually believed. I love the irony of that. Here's a guy who hates Christians and makes fun of them, but because he's got no dog in the hunt, as it were, it makes his view all the more real and trustworthy, because he's showing you this is what Christians actually believed, and I'm making fun of them for it. So this is what he says, right? The Christians would worship a man who introduced this new cult. Remember, he's a pagan. To him, Christians are a cult. Who introduced this new cult, and they crucified him on that account. And from the moment Christians, are converted, they deny the gods of Greece in order to worship this crucified sage. And then, can you believe this? They actually tried to follow his laws and live like this crucified sage. And all of this, it's insane. They believe it all on faith. He's making fun of what the Christians believed. What I'm trying to show you here is that there's a consistent thread of what Christians have maintained and held true for 2,000 years. It wasn't invented in the 400 or 500. Constantine didn't invent it at the Council of Nicaea. There's a constant thread of Christian belief that both the Bible and non-biblical sources affirm. Okay? Pliny the Younger was a governor of an area in northern Turkey. He's writing a letter to Emperor Trajan. He's like, I got these Christians. I think they're criminals, but they're not really doing anything criminalish. What should I do with them? And he's like, I grabbed 2 women who were slaves. I tortured them to kind of get information from them. Apparently they're like deaconesses, whatever that is, in this thing they call church. And this is what he learned after tormenting these 2 female deaconesses. He said the Christians, they were accustomed to meeting together on a fixed day, Sunday, before dawn, and to sing a hymn to Christ as if he were a god, worship. And then when this was over, they would leave, but then they'd come back together later and they would have ordinary food. Okay? They would partake in ordinary innocent food, bread, wine, the most common food of that time. You see the most basic elements of church. Although they got up at dawn, most of us don't get up at sunrise to go down to the beach and worship Jesus. Not that we have a beach, but those sunrise services, guys. And so, again, here we have secular history affirming what Christians did, what Christians believed. All of these things are happening within a century of Christianity. And by a century, I mean the apostles dying, and within a century of all of that. And as we know from several other early church fathers, and honestly, church tradition, we'll be fair and say it's not fully known, but we know for sure that at least 4 of the apostles and how they died. The rest are kind of tradition. But some of those deaths included crucifixion, beheading. Some were shot with arrows. Some were stabbed with a spear. Thomas in India. Okay, one was even filleted. Okay, poor Bartholomew had a little skin removal process. If you don't understand what filleted means. Fact number 6, I think this is probably the strongest. It's one thing when people who love Jesus become his followers and become hardcore for him, but what about his enemies? What about people who hate him, who hated him while he was alive? And now that they have seen the resurrected Christ, their lives have completely changed. What do you do with that, right? What do you do with James, his half-brother? What do you do with Paul, Saul, right? The Gospels tell us straight up. His own brothers, James and the other 3, they did not believe in him. Okay? On 2 occasions, they even said, Jesus is out of his mind. He's crazy. We think he's a lunatic. Lock him up. Put him in a white jacket. And Paul hated Christians. Okay? It says Paul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. And then he saw the resurrected Christ. He saw his own brother come back to life. Right? It says in 1 Corinthians 15, after being raised, Jesus appeared to 500 eyewitnesses, more on that in a little bit, and at once, and then he appeared to James. Years later, when Paul is visiting Jerusalem, he says, I saw Peter, and I saw John, and I saw James, the Lord's brother. They are all pillars of the church in Jerusalem. Like, do you understand what a pillar does? It holds it all up. This guy who used to make fun of him and thought he was a madman, not only became his follower, he became the leader of the Jerusalem church. It's a total 180. And as Paul put it himself, right? He said, lastly, Jesus appeared to me as one untimely born. For even though I am the least of the apostles, I don't even deserve to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. A complete change of heart. How do they die, right? Secular history and Christian, like church history, they both tell us exactly the same thing. Josephus tells us that he was stoned. Other historians in the church tell us, well, yeah, he was stoned, but actually first they pushed him over the temple top. He fell down several stories, probably broke a few bones, but he wasn't actually dead when he hit the bottom. They pushed him off the temple top, and then they stoned him to finish him off, because he was still apparently only partially dead. And Paul, very famous. Paul's one of those deaths that we can verify because Paul is Paul. He writes, half the New Testament. He's really famous. I like the way Tertullian put it. He kind of puts it in poetic terms. He says, Paul won his crown in death like John the Baptist. Okay, see Mark 6 if you need to know how, John died. And then other Jewish or other Christian historians just do a more literal thing. Paul was beheaded. Okay, these men died for their faith. These enemies of Christ who became his followers when they saw his resurrection. And not just his followers. They went from being the greatest enemy of Christianity. Paul goes from being the greatest enemy of Christianity to becoming its greatest champion. What necessitates that change? A resurrected Christ. Nothing else makes sense. So those are the facts that I've kind of just laid out for you in a general way. There are more, but we're just kind of trying to keep it simple. So if it's not the resurrection, what are the other hypotheses that have existed? Well, they've had 2,000 years, and I'm going to give you 6 of them. These are the best they've got in 2,000 years, and it's pitiful. Okay? Number 1, Jesus' body was stolen from the tomb. We've talked about that. One's in the scripture. Jesus didn't actually die. He swooned. He fainted. The women went to the wrong tomb. No sense of direction, ladies. Come on. It was one giant mass hallucination. Jesus had a substitute, a twin. Someone who looked like him got crucified instead. Or it was all just a lie. It's a myth. It's a legend. It's all just made up. That's it. That's the best they've had in 2,000. That's the best they've got in 2,000 years. So I love this picture. It's really fun. So I'm going to go through these one by one. I'm going to talk about them in a general way, and then I'm going to show you some of the problems in them. Okay? So number 1, the stolen body theory. Okay? So let's play this out to its logical full extension. Okay? This is the idea that on Saturday night, the once terrified apostles snuck out of the upper room. They get past the sleeping guards despite knowing the penalty if they're asleep. And remember, they do this in shifts, right? Like one guy is sleeping, but the other guys are awake for 2 hours. And then one guy gets, so they have like a 2-hour rotation. So all of them being asleep would be highly improbable. Anyways, they move this giant 1-ton rock made of limestone. They've calculated the hole, the door, the size, how much rock you would need. And limestone is the most common rock in Jerusalem. So you can calculate the weight and use math to, figure it out. So they move this giant boulder out of the way, not making any noise. They go in the tomb. These 11 men go in the tomb. They decide, hey, it'll be a lot easier if we unwrap Jesus' body here, despite knowing the guards are outside and can wake up at any minute. So they take off the grave clothes. And then, because men, we are very neat and organized, we fold up the grave clothes. Seriously, read John 20, verse 6. When the women and the men arrive the next day, the laundry is folded. Because, that's what we're famous for, men, right? Folding laundry. Neatly. So after we stole the body, we folded the laundry, we've unwrapped him, we moved the giant rock, and we didn't wake up the Romans at all. We took the body, and we left. Okay. Yeah. Okay. You see the problems. You can see the problems very quickly. But yet, the next day, again, the guards go to the Pharisees and say, hey, what should we do? Because we're going to die if we tell him your story, if we tell this story. Here's the money, say it anyways. And when your commanders hear about it, when Pilate hears about it, we will cover for you. And that is what the Jews believe to this day. And some of the Talmudic Jews, again, have their necromancy hypothesis too. Problems. Honestly, could the apostles have actually done this if they wanted to? I mean, I kind of make lighthearted of this, but what are the odds? Seriously, what are the odds? Did they just are they the luckiest people on earth and they arrive and all the guards are asleep by chance and coincidence, despite knowing the dire consequences? Do you want to have sticks and stones thrown at you by 4,000 other men? I don't think so. Afterwards, most importantly, for those of you who've read your Agatha Christie novels and your whodunit and your murder mysteries, getting rid of the body is always the hardest part of the crime, right? How do you get rid of the body? What did they do with it? There's no mention of Jesus' body being taken and put in some Dead Scroll cave somewhere. What do you do with that? Where's the body? And like the silly video from earlier highlights, what do you hope to gain? Okay? People are people in every generation. I don't care. Men are motivated by power, by money, by fame. The same things that motivate men and women today are the same things that motivated them thousands of years ago. People are people no matter what century they live in. And we are greedy, we are selfish, we are opportunists, and we want to be loved and to be admired and to be popular, blah, 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 blah. The apostles did not get any of that. I mean, what? I'm going to travel around the world, give up my life to go around telling random strangers about some made-up story about Jesus' resurrection just to get persecuted and killed for it later. Really? Would you, for a lie, go around the world telling random strangers something that you know is not true, and then when they kill you for it, you decide you're going to just do it 10 times harder than before, instead of giving up and going home? I've taught long enough to know when students do hard things and they can't succeed after about the 4th time of failure, they give up. And then usually the tears follow and them screaming about how much they hate math and they never want to do it again. You know it's true. Let alone something that's more significant than this. The swoon theory. This is a hilarious one. This is the idea that Jesus did not die on the cross, but he fainted, he swooned. He was unconscious. His followers assumed that he was dead, apparently so did the Romans, and they buried him. A few days later, in the cool of the tomb, this is also called the cool tomb theory, the cool tomb, the cool air of the cave revived him. And either he or his followers, that varies from version to version, moved the stone, good luck, and then declare a miracle had happened. I'm alive. I'm actually just going to quote the doctors on this. The American Medical Association did a study of this a few years ago, long time ago, 1986. And in the Journal of American Medicine, this is what a group of doctors said. It said, clearly the weight of historical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side. He wasn't playing possum on the cross when they put a spear through his side. Through his side was inflicted and supports the traditional view that a spear thrust into his right ribs probably perforated not only the right lung, but also the pericardium and the heart, thereby ensuring death. Accordingly, the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appears to be at odds with all modern medical knowledge. The idea that he just went unconscious despite getting stabbed and then the blood and water comes out the side is at odds with all medical knowledge. In other words, he wasn't playing possum. He wasn't unconscious. He was dead. He was dead, most likely of a heart attack, basically. His engine overheated because he had no oil, i.e. blood. Problems with the swoon theory, okay? Scourging alone would be enough to kill you. Crucifixion alone would be enough to kill you from the blood loss and just the pure physical trauma that you go through. If you've watched Passion of the Christ, you kind of get an idea of where I'm going with that. And again, Pilate asked for verification. So Pilate's like, are you sure he's really dead? Let me go check. Hey, centurion, go see if Jesus is really dead. So Pilate thought he was dead. The centurion who crucifies tens of thousands of people a year thought he was dead. Jesus would have had no food, no water, no medical treatment for 3 days. Okay? He's pierced in the wrists, the feet, the side, the lungs, the heart with the spirit. The guy's got trauma all over his body. More importantly than that, he wasn't in a cool tomb. He was wrapped up in 75 pounds worth of bandages, spices, linens, myrrh. If I wrapped any one of you who is healthy in that much, 75 pounds of pressure on you, you would pass out from heat exhaustion and suffocation, let alone someone who's gone through all the trauma of scourging and the cross. It just doesn't work. Okay? And then just the pure medical fact, he's lost all that blood. His blood pressure is very low. So what's going to happen? Normal medical things that would happen to you and I. His body would go into hypovolemic shock, which would later have led to pericardial effusion, pleural effusion, which is basically when you get a fluid around your heart and around your lungs. Hence why when he stabs him, John's not a doctor, it's mostly water, but it's got proteins and other things in there, in that fluid. So when he's getting stabbed and John sees the blood and water coming out, yeah. But when a doctor looks at that, he sees that stuff. Next theory, the wrong tomb theory. This is the idea that the women, and later the men, because Peter, Paul, the Romans, they all went there too. In their grief, they just had no sense of direction. And they go to the wrong tomb, which was empty, so they just assumed that because we're at the wrong tomb, but we think it's the right tomb, but this tomb is empty, so therefore Jesus must be alive. That's quite the leap in logic. This goes against what we see in the scriptures as far as, look, the women were there at his crucifixion. The women were there when Joseph was burying him. They knew where it was. All four Gospels attest to that. Why is that important? Because if we're just making this up, with no disrespect, ladies, your testimony doesn't count for diddly in the first century. It's like going to the Middle East today into a Muslim country, okay? The testimony of women means very little in Middle Eastern Muslim countries back then, and today, it just didn't account for much. Okay? In the Jewish and Gentile world, the testimony of women counted for very little. It was viewed as unreliable in court. In truth, it was actually culturally embarrassing for early Christians to go around the Jewish Roman world and telling people that, hey, women saw Jesus alive first. It would have been culturally embarrassing for that. And if you were making something up, you're not going to make up a story that you want to convince people is true by using modern equivalent words of, well, once upon a time. But that's pretty much what it was like by saying girls saw him first. And yet all four say it. Why? Because it's true. They may not have liked to have admitted that it's true, but they said it's true because it's true. Okay? Again, the problems with this, does that mean that the Pharisees and the Romans went to the wrong tomb as well? And even if the Romans and the Jews go to the right tomb, wouldn't they have just been able to say, well, Jesus is alive? No, he's not. He's buried right there. Once Christianity became a threat to them, they could have just said, the body's right over there. You guys are crazy. Your women have no sense of direction. Peter and John, you got no sense of direction. We know where he's buried. They never produced a body. And kind of the most obvious thing here, the owner of the tomb, Joseph of Arimathea, you don't think he knows where the family plot is? Yeah. This one is, I think, the most ludicrous. I'm sorry. This is the idea that the Christians, his followers, in their grief-strickenness, they were sincere, but they were sincerely wrong. They sincerely imagined that they saw Jesus alive again. It was all just a hallucination. Problem with this, even though they're grief-stricken, a lot of them are still thinking logically. Thomas says plainly, right? Until I can touch him, I'm not going to believe. He might be emotionally compromised in his grief a little, but he hasn't stopped thinking logically. He's like, yeah, usually dead people don't get up from the grave. Until I can see him and touch the wounds myself, I will not believe. That's not the opinion of someone who's going into a complete emotional breakdown. It's just a normal person. Most of you in here would probably have the exact same reaction. I like how Lee Strobel has this really great quote. Lee Strobel said, I went to a psychologist friend of mine and said, hey, if 500 people claimed to see Jesus alive after he died, it was just a hallucination, right? And he said, hallucinations are individual events. If 500 people all have the same hallucination, well, that's a bigger miracle than the resurrection. Here are the problems, and boy, do they come quickly. First of all, group hallucinations are incredibly rare. And they are usually one-time only events. And by groups, let me be clear about this. I mean like 5 or 6 people. Oh, we all saw a UFO. We all hallucinated a UFO or whatever. And then you actually start questioning them individually. Well, it was orange and circular shape. No, it was actually yellow and it looked like a cigar. Like you actually start talking to them and they all agree on what they saw, but they don't agree on what it looked like. So when I say group hallucination, it's more like group hysteria. However, you have 500 people who saw Jesus all at the exact same time. And guess what? They all saw the exact same thing, him alive. And many of those people were alive when the New Testament was getting written. If there was a problem, someone would have said something. And Jesus appears not just once, he appears on 8 different occasions to various groups of people. Most importantly, even if they were just hallucinating, again, it always comes back to the empty tomb. Where's the body? If he's just a figment of their imagination, then his corpse is still in the tomb. And the Romans and the Jews would have pointed this out to them and would have laughed at them and called them crazy. You're a bunch of mad, crazy fools. You think apparitions are real physical people. And yet they don't. Why? Because they weren't hallucinating. And most importantly, what do you do with what do you do with Paul and what do you do with James? They're not Jesus lovers. They're Jesus haters. They're glad he's dead. And yet, when he appears to them alive, it changes them forever. In fact, they die believing he rose from the grave. And one day, they too will rise from the grave. Okay? So, yeah, his followers hallucinate. His enemies aren't going to hallucinate him alive. I'm sure James had enough inferiority complexes about his brother. Okay? Why can't you be like your brother Jesus? He never gets in trouble at school. He always does the dishes. He always takes out the trash. His teachers only say nice things about him. Why can't you be more like your big brother? Has serious inferiority complex, no doubt. And yet he has a total change of heart. Why? Because he saw Christ risen. This one is the most ludicrous. This is the idea that because Thomas is the Greek word and the Aramaic word for twin, didymus in Greek, it must automatically mean that Thomas's twin had to be Jesus. Because clearly the New Testament talks about no other person than Jesus. So the twin must be Jesus. So when the angel shows up to Mary, hey, Mary, you're having twins. One of them will be the anointed Son of God, the chosen one, and he'll save the world. And the other one will just be, we'll call him twin. Really? So yeah, it's like super virgin birth. Twin virgin. Like, come on, no. So anyways, when Judas and company show up to arrest Jesus on that night, they arrest the wrong guy. They arrest Thomas because apparently he's supposed to look like Jesus. And so Thomas gets crucified while Jesus just kind of scurries off. And then a few days later and says, hey, I'm alive. The Muslims have a similar view. Many Muslim sects hold to a form of this belief, but it's not Thomas. It's actually Simon of Cyrene, the guy who helped Jesus carry the cross. And while they're carrying the cross, Jesus kind of does like a little magic trick, snaps his fingers, and he changes their physical appearance. So that Simon now looks like Jesus, and Jesus now looks like Simon. And when they get to the top of Calvary, the Romans grab Jesus, who's actually Simon, and they crucify him. And the actual Jesus, who looks like Simon, is standing there laughing at Simon who's getting crucified, and he walks away and teleports off. One of the Quran verses that kind of that hints at this, they killed Jesus not, they crucified him not. It only appeared that they actually killed Simon. Okay. Problems. Number one, yes, his name means twin. But there is no place in the Bible that says he's Jesus' twin. There is no place in the Bible that says they look alike. They are not doppelgangers, okay? None. And again, the women are there. Mary Magdalene is there. His mother is there. All the other women were there at the cross. And you know what they saw immediately and who they recognized immediately? Jesus. Okay? You don't think a mom knows what their kid looks like? And again, it comes back to the empty tomb. It always comes back to the empty tomb. If there is a second Jesus who's crucified somewhere and who's dead and buried somewhere, if Jesus is running around saying, I'm alive, why is the tomb empty? Then you still have to have the guys go beat up the Romans or wait for them to fall asleep and steal the body. You still have a corpse in that tomb, even if they grab the wrong guy. What do you do? See, the tomb is empty. All of these crash and break upon the waters of that one fact, the empty tomb. All of these theories fall apart on that one fact alone. And there are many other facts that they break on as well. And again, if it's all just a hoax, the change in the apostles, the change in James and Paul, are they going to all die for a hoax? Would you? And the idea that Simon was crucified instead of, like, there's no place in history that ever says this. There's not even the cults and the church heretics in the first 500 years of Christianity even thought of this. This was a uniquely Muslim thing that exists only in Islam, and no one else ever even tries to put this forth as a hypothesis. It's them and them alone. In fact, many of them try not even to do it anymore. They tend to go for the swoon theory these days, from what I understand. But not even the early heretics, the original heretics, didn't even think of this. Last one. I hope you're all sticking with me. We're almost done. Okay? This is honestly probably the most believable. If I wasn't a Christian, this is the one that I would go for. But even it falls apart so easily. And this is the idea that either Jesus never existed at all. At that point, you are ignoring all the historical quotes and stuff that I gave you earlier. And many, many more that I didn't put in here because I didn't want you all to fall asleep on me. So to say he doesn't exist at all. Or that Jesus there was a real historical Jesus. He ticked off the powerful people, and the powerful people killed him like they did to Socrates and to other famous people in history who, when you take on the powerful, what do people in power fear? Losing power, and so they kill you. So their power is not threatened anymore. And that Jesus is just that. And as the story of Jesus gets passed around like the ultimate game of telephone, the story just gets bigger and bigger and more exaggerated, like when Grandpa tells you the story of when he caught a fish this big, and then 30 years later he's telling the grandkids he's catching a shark, right? And that's what happened with Jesus. Problem with that, Jesus' own followers, first of all, Peter hits his head on. He says, look, we did not invent these cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the coming of our Lord Jesus, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. John says, look, that which was from the beginning, Jesus, we heard him, we touched him, we saw him alive, we saw him resurrected. We weren't just making something up. We interacted with him physically. Again, problems. To say that Jesus never existed ignores all the historical evidence that exists out there. Secular and Christian alike, in the decades and the centuries that followed the resurrection. At that point, how do you prove anything? If you dismiss the historical evidence and say Jesus never existed, at that point, you can't even prove Muhammad was real. You can't prove that Buddha was real. You can't even prove that Julius Caesar was real at that point. How do you prove anyone existed? In 1,000 years, how will we prove you exist? You think there will be some Facebook around that'll still have your profile on it? There's more evidence that Jesus existed than almost any other person in history. And to dismiss that is to dismiss every other historical person. None of you questioned that Alexander the Great was real, or that Julius Caesar was real, or that Muhammad was real, or the Dalai Lama was real. And yet you want to do that for Jesus? Why? Yet again, okay, even if Jesus was just a normal guy and the story about him got bigger and exaggerated as the decades go on, why did all of Jesus' friends and enemies still say the body was missing? Oh, the resurrection got added on a century or two later. No, it didn't. It was there from the beginning. All the creeds, all the writings, both religious and secular, talk about him rising from the grave. From the beginning. And lastly, look, we have no one who denies that Jesus did miracles. We have no one who denies the empty grave, okay? We have different explanations. He was demon-possessed. The disciples came and stole the body. We have different explanations, but we don't have different facts. He taught, he lived, he did miracles, he died. His body was missing 3 days later. Different explanations, but the same facts. And as far as the exaggeration thing goes, John is the last gospel written almost 60 years after the account, 30 years after the first three, roughly. So if any of them is going to be exaggerated, then John should be the most exaggerated of all the New Testament writing. And yet it's not. It has high Christology, absolutely. But it's not more exaggerated than the other three. In fact, in many ways, it's actually more conservative. There's only 7 miracles in John. You can go to almost any page in Matthew, you'll find 7 miracles on one page. There's no Mount of Transfiguration where Jesus gets shiny. There's not one verse in John where Jesus cast out a demon. It's demon-free almost in John. So all of the sensational is actually in the synoptics. John, in many ways, is actually far more conservative by comparison. And yet he's last and he's supposed to be the most exaggerated? When that's not the case whatsoever. Here's the reality. Here's what it all comes down to. If you remember nothing else, remember this. What's left of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob is buried there. That is the cave of the patriarchs. It's owned by Muslims today, so good luck trying to get there. But if you can, good for you. What's left of David is in there. What's left of Muhammad is in there. What's left of Buddha is in there. What's left of Confucius is in there. There is only one religion that has an empty tomb. There is only one that has a Messiah who rose from the grave. There's only one Savior. And he's not there. Why? As the angel said, he has risen. There is one view that accounts for all the evidence, historical or religious. And that is exactly what the New Testament says, that Jesus Christ rose from the grave. That's the only other one that's there. It's the only one that works. Thank you.